back, everybody. So, as you can see on screen is an image of Kukai Kobodashi, and I thought this evening I would try something a little bit different and give you some examples about the awakening of faith that have to do with Kukai's life. So we will give that a shot this evening and see how it goes. But before we do that, welcome back. And I hope everyone is doing really well. We continue to be in the midst of some serious national challenges. I've continued to get questions from people all over the world and here locally about how things are doing in Portland. Things are fine. So the courthouse and the area of protest is not that far from the temple. Portland is a mid-sized city. The area affected is about 2 to 4 blocks downtown. So it sounds like the governor and the vice president have an agreement, and less, maybe I'll say clashes downtown is the hope. Protests will continue, no doubt. That is part of the culture here in the city. But we're hoping they will take a different turn and look different. So that's the first announcement. So we're still here. The other thing, we have some events coming up, so I don't forget to mention them before the end of this evening. We have some events coming up. So this Sunday, we have the movie and movie discussion. So if you have time to join us, please do. I think you'll all find the movie interesting. It's Walk With Me, regarding the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. I believe it's narrated by Benjamin Cumberbatch, so some people may watch it just for that. But I hope everyone can have a chance to watch it and then bring your reflections and ideas and comments to the discussion. I'd appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I haven't seen it yet. I remember when the movie was made and Cumberbatch did a interview sort of coming out as Buddhist to the world, and I think he learned a lot through making it. So I think we'll all find it very interesting. Other things are, we will have a modified Obon service. So we're still taking a very careful approach here at the temple and not having in-person activities. So I'm here by myself. So we've decided to do Obon online. So I hope you can join us for that if you're able. And we're also going to be commemorating in the next few days the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan by ringing the temple bell in solidarity with the Portland sister cities. So the sister city program has events that are coordinated to happen at the same time between the local city and the sister city. So we will be commemorating that in recognition of the only time atomic weapons have been used in war, and I think our shared hope that we never see that again. So if you can join us for that. I'm not sure how it may damage your speakers. The bell is rather large, so we'll see how it all goes, but it'll be a good moment of solidarity with our sister cities across the ocean. So I don't think if I'm forgetting any other announcements, I apologize. Before I start, are there any questions that either came up from last week's class or just in general? No? Any questions? Comments? Okay. I'll try to monitor the chat window also. So if you have questions or comments as we go through, then I will try to keep an eye on that as well. So it's good to see so many people joining us this evening. Um, Welcome, and we'll get into the awakening of faith again. I am going to do something similar to what I did last week, which is talk about what we've covered thus far in the text. We're not going to refer back to the text specifically tonight. I just want to give us an idea of where we are and maybe a little bit more context as to why the awakening of faith is important, and especially why it's important in Shingon, why it's recommended, and give you some examples from Kukai's own life. So there's a little bit more of an experimental approach, but I hope you get something out of it. And I hope, especially from the perspective of why does Shingon value this text, hopefully we'll have a little bit better perspective on that. And my hope is a little bit better perspective on some of the common questions I get about Shingon. Questions maybe why we are not as popular as Zen. That's another question I get often. Or why a lot of people haven't heard of our school. So I think some of that may become clearer by the end of the night. But again, as always, I do welcome your questions and your input. I know some people like to email afterwards. That's great. I really appreciate when you let me know what you enjoyed, what parts are unclear. So we'll try to, this is a work in progress to make the Dharma talk easier to approach and more relevant. So how does the awakening of faith weave into our practice as Shingon Buddhists? The key concept, if you remember back when we started the lecture, and if my notes are right, this is about the 24th lecture on the awakening of faith. So someone do the math on how many Thursdays where that takes us. I think we started last fall. But when we started, we mentioned a concept called one mind with two aspects. And this is a bit of a cryptic, as is with many things that you get from classical Chinese. The translation is very succinct. And being succinct, it's not always clear what we meant. So as we've gone through the first few chapters of the Awakening of Faith, the text is telling us that our mind operates with two aspects. One, our original nature, our Buddha nature, that part of us that we're trying to rediscover, and that part of us that we want to bring forth through spiritual practice. And there's another side of our mind that is our samsaric nature, that part of us that maybe digs the hole deeper into which we find ourselves currently, that finds it difficult to see past immediate appearances. The part of our mind that a few classes ago we gave the example of Greek philosophy, the shadows in the cave, that looks at the shadows and tries to decipher them without getting at the what is actually casting the shadows. So we have a variety of different ideas here, but this idea of the one mind with two aspects is kind of the key component of the awakening of faith. And that component is really bound up with practice, especially the way practice is seen in Shingon and That is also true for a lot of other spiritual systems, but they present the idea differently. So Buddhism doesn't claim to have a monopoly on religious truth or religious insight. What's unique in Buddhism is how it's presented and the method that's provided for understanding and realizing that religious insight. Kukai's theory is that by using language, right? So we remember this one mind with two aspects. By using language, language is conditioned. Language is very much a creature of our culture, of um, our location, of, language has limits. And language is part of samsara. So we're trying to explain the original nature by using something that is limited. It doesn't have the ability to fully explain what we're talking about. So you always have a connection or a combination of theory and practice. Right? Theory is going to give you a framework for understanding, and through practice, you're trying to actually achieve that insight on your own. So Kukai's writings, all of these things, focus on there's a limitation to what you can get out of study. That doesn't mean that study isn't useful, but just knowing that is limited. The rest must be experienced. And some of that experience is written about. And I hope as we go through tonight, you'll see some of that experience comes out of Kukai's own practice and his own experience, his own life story. So we'll go through some of those scenes in his life a little bit. If you compare Buddhism with other religion, you're going to see a difference in how religion is communicated. So Buddhism is communicated through teaching, but also through experience. And for that means each individual has the opportunity for direct experience. It's not specifically taught through dogma or a prophet. So it's not entirely accurate to compare the Buddha to a prophet. So the Buddha isn't getting the message from somewhere else and then giving it to you, right? So no one told the Buddha the Dharma. The Buddha woke up to or realized this truth about the universe and then decided to share it with others. So these are very different than, let's say, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Those are revealed religions where the deity or the God is revealing the truth to one chosen person, and then that person is teaching, and then that person says, "This is what you should do." So the two are slightly different, and it's going to be important for how we practice and how we view a text like the Awakening of Faith, but also how we view it in terms of our own practice. So when we use the word mikyo, so something mysterious or mystical, that really is getting at how do you get the information. You're not getting it from a prophet, you're getting it through experience. And I hope as we talk further, you'll see that from Kukai's own life. So this mysterious nature often gets people very interested in Shingon. Oh, it's something mysterious. I want to find out, what is this all about? And I want to stress this has a little bit more to do with the direct experience and structure rather than magic, even though outwardly they look very similar. So what do we mean by that? If you ask me what is the mystery in Shingon, it's going to be difficult to explain. And it's difficult to explain because it's something that goes beyond common language. So it's something that really transcends the ability to logically explain. And sometimes people have the experience of this, when they either practice ritual or take part in a ritual. So most often, the first time someone experiences the Goma, the fire ritual, they see something different or unusual. Um, they sometimes visit Koyasan and the morning service, they feel something that is difficult to put in words, and that sparks their interest. Um, I'll give you an example. If we probably all know that walking through the forest can relieve our stress, we feel better, we feel lighter afterwards. But if we ask why that is, it might be difficult for us to explain it. But no one's ever asked you that. Um, you just know it intrinsically. You know, I had stress or studying for a big test, or I had a big decision to make, and I went for a walk in nature, and I felt better. So no one says, "Well, tell me exactly the mechanism by which this walking through the trees took away your stress." So we intuitively understand that this is the case. If we look, if we swim in the ocean, we may feel rejuvenated. If we get up early in the morning and breathe in the morning air, we feel better. We feel full of vitality and energy. If we look at the fall color, it may evoke an emotion. If a lot of things in the natural world have this effect, and we don't question one another. Tell me exactly why you're smiling when you see a flower. By what mechanism has the flower, you know, moved your face into a smile? We don't ask that question. But when it comes to spiritual practice, we do. But I would put to you that in many ways they're very similar. They are experiences that transcend logical thought, but because they are more common, we don't question them. We understand that these experiences exist, and we seek out those experiences. We stop and smell the flowers. We look at the fall color, and we're happy. And when we do explain the feelings that the natural world gives us, we normally give it to another type of language, right? We give it to art, we give it to poetry, we give it to music to evoke what our feeling is. We don't write a dissertation on how it is that a tree with a certain number of leaves specifically alleviates a certain amount of stress. We don't think of it in these ways. But when it comes to spiritual practice, sometimes we get more rigid. Um, how exactly is this practice going to give us this result? Or on the other hand, why do I need any theory? I just have a feeling when I do practice. So this is actually a lot about of what the awakening of faith is about. It's about giving us a framework for understanding experience, because insight, this insight into our true nature, this insight into the mind with its two aspects, is different enough that we have to study it. It's different enough that we have to do something more than take a walk in the woods. Um, and so to get a better understanding of this, I'm going to give us some highlights from Kukai's life, and that might give us a better understanding. May help us get a little bit more insight into what we're talking about. Kukai's the earliest writings, or the writings about the earliest part of his life, describe him playing and making Buddhist images out of clay. So just a normal kid. At least boys do this. I wasn't a little girl in this lifetime, but my little boy self played in the dirt often, and most of the times I made forts, or we were very keen to make dams to see if we could dam up the storm water, the rainwater flows. And we run outside after every rain to see if our little wall was successful. Kukai was ahead of me, and when he played, he made small Buddhist images. So early on, his parents recognized he's different. He's a little bit more intuitive, aware. Maybe he has a penchant for spiritual practice early on, so it shows through in how he played. As he goes through life, there's this constant search. There's an asking questions and challenging himself that happens throughout. And I'll read you. These actually are snippets of his life and come from Koya-san's website, actually. So I'll put this picture up so you can see. Oh, there. So the image I've shared is from the Shikoku pilgrimage, and it memorializes an image from Kukai's life as a young child. So the description is when Kukai was young, his given name was Mao. So the childhood play of Mao involved making Buddhist images in the dirt, collecting grass and wood to make shrines, and worshiping the Buddha. At about age 7, he scaled the nearby Sashin Dake Peak and prayed to the Buddha. When I become big, I want to aid the ailing. If I shall have that power, please bless me with a long life. And he jumped into a ravine. Thereupon, from somewhere, a rather beautiful sound manifested along with a celestial maiden, and Mao was firmly taken into her grasp. Mao was jubilated and thus became even more zealous in his study. So this is a very popular story in Kukai's early childhood life. So you see this celestial maiden or angel coming to catch him, having jumped from the cliff, and it probably seems a little unusual from our Western perspective, but I think it illustrates that even as a young child, first he's expressing this desire to help people, and then wanting to know, would he be successful in that, and the willingness to sacrifice himself, right? Put all of his energy, all of his focus in life to the benefit of others. So it's the earliest example of the bodhisattva vow being perfected or coming about in this very young child. So this is the image. This is the early imagery that we have of Kukai's life, and we don't have a lot of additional detail until he gets a little bit older. So, oops, until he gets a little bit older. So when he gets a little bit older, is sort of the next phase in life. In this phase, we actually have his own writings to reflect on. But Kukai showed promise. He was a very intelligent child. And because he showed that promise and intelligence, it was determined that he would be sent to school. So it bears a commentary. There were no, it's not compulsory K through 12 education at that time. Everyone who was educated generally followed the Chinese model, which was you would study with a private tutor. So it should tell you, it required your family to have some level of wealth, and Kukai's family was part of the nobility. So he was sent to the capital to study with his uncle, and that would be his tutoring. So what kind of education do you get at that time? Is it the typical childhood textbooks and things like that? Actually, education focused around the Chinese classics. So you'd be learning poetry and Chinese history, music, and some pretty heavy topics. I guess perhaps it was ending when I was younger, but it was still fashionable, or I guess you had the option in school to study the Greek classics and learn Latin when I was in grade school. So that was a course of study. So I do remember some of my classmates walking around with the small books with Latin and reading Greek classics and things like that. So that type of classical education was available at that time. Um, I, I doubt we'll find that in public schools anymore today, but that was more along the lines of what he was studying. So the next phase or the next scene that we have detail is this. There's a brief write-up I think I mentioned on Koyasan's website, so I'm just reading from that. So it jumps to his late teens, early 20s. So it says Mao, who enjoyed worshiping the Buddha, also studied very well. By the age of 14, he was studying at Sanuki, but when he was 15, he left for the capital and studied the writings of his uncle, Confucian scholar, um, and entered the university at age 18. So the university at this phase would be more of a larger group of students studying together, not exactly a private tutor, but still would be very limited. Not the university as we would think of it, more like perhaps again the classical understanding of that, the academy. So entering into a group of people who are studying together, like-minded thinkers. So this is more um, the idea, not going from classroom to classroom in an established school in the same way we think of. So it says, however, as the study at university was focused on Confucianism, which aims at promoting oneself and did not concern aiding those in need, he gradually came to possess an interest in Buddhism. Thus, he often visited Konzo Daitoku of Iwabuchi Temple in Nara and listened to valuable talks about the Buddha. So this entry is discussing Kukai's early search for truth and meaning. And one of the things that he found lacking in Confucianism, so if you haven't read the Confucian classics, I'll try to sum them up in a few minutes. The Confucian classics focus on the classical relationships of the individual to society. And what is your relationship to your parents, to your state, right, to your country, to friends, to your teacher, and so on. And by maintaining these understandings, then the society is harmonious. So Kukai found that for the most part, as a social structure, Confucianism was good, but he was looking for something broader. What would, from his youngest ages as a child, thinking of helping, all people, what teaching would help him understand that? And so he found Confucianism lacking. He found, there should be something more, something deeper, and that's what he was searching for. So part of what I want to highlight with this is he's always searching. There's always a search that's happening, and that search is, as we saw in the Awakening of Faith, kind of the enlightened mind permeating samsara, right? There's something deep within him, pushing him forward, that's conflicting with what society is telling him he should do. So society is saying, study and you'll get a good job and you'll have a comfortable life. And he is not content with this trajectory, right? This is a ready-made path, and that's not making him happy. So he's looking for something more. So there's this constant searching. I would point out that he doesn't drop out of school and start a rock band. He doesn't drop out of school and start a high-tech company in his garage. So our society celebrates that same sort of entrepreneurial spirit in some ways, but this is quite different, right? He's looking for a teaching, a framework to propel the regard he has for humanity. Right? He wants to help people. He wants to see people's lives improved, and so he's searching for that. I think all of us have gone through some sort of search. Either we're trying to find ourselves. Maybe in school we became very interested in a particular type of thinking, philosophy. We may have had a religious experience or a spiritual experience of our own, and so we did, a period of searching and looking around. And this is very much similar, right? It's that age where the responsibilities of life are not so heavy that you can't do the search. And I think that's part of what's driving Kukai at this point. If you stay in the structure for too long, it's going to take over and it's going to be very difficult to break out. And that very much is sort of the next image that we find um, in Kukai's life. So starting his new life. So Mao, who began on the way of the Buddha and devoted his entire life for the good of the world and people, before long left university and continued his pursuit of knowledge by seeking out spiritual places throughout Japan. Then finally, he overcame the resistance of his family and determined to enter the priesthood. At age 20, um, he cut off his hair for tonsure, became a monk, and changed his name to uh, Kyokai. Later, he changed it to Yoku, and his body and mind became disciples of the Buddha. So this discusses his leaving school and deciding to enter the priesthood and starting a new life. Um, this was not obviously an easy decision, right? If you drop out of college or something these days, you might have a tense conversation with your dad who's paying the tuition, but it's probably not as dramatic as this. On the other hand, if you drop out of school and tell your family you're moving into a monastery, that might come as a shock. So he had some things to overcome. The scene is actually dramatized in the movie. The family's sort of looking for him, knowing he's dropped out of school and wanting to know what path he's on, and he comes back to visit and announce his intentions. So this is a momentous shift, right? This is a big change, and I think it shows from our perspective the intensity of the interest in these spiritual questions, that they aren't momentary pursuits, they're not momentary interests, they are such powerful motivators in his life that he gives up everything, right? Leaves school and cuts his hair and becomes a monk. So that's a very, again, that's very different from starting a rock band in the garage or, you know, being the next Bill Gates, right? There's no promise of fame here. In fact, he's walking away from the cushy life of being an official and probably having a mansion and servants and position in society. So this is a significant departure from what he went to the capital for. I would also note it says here that Kukai becomes a monk, so he took the novice ordination. So at that time, as far as I know, all of Asia, there may be a few countries that didn't adhere to this. They all follow the Chinese model, where if you were ordained, you had to get government approval. So there was a sort of a social control component to this. This may come as a surprise from our American perspective, where we have freedom of religion, and the government has no say in our spiritual practice. But at this time, if you were to be ordained as a monk or nun, you would be outside the system of taxation, and also you would not have to participate in compulsory military service. So I think Canada still does this. At least when I was younger, I grew up on the border of Canada. You'd always see the young people in uniform, so they had to do some military service. I don't know if we have anybody from Canada today can tell me if that's still the requirement.
Yeah,
But
no, it's not mandatory.
oh, okay, thank you. I
Oh,
was curious. I was always I always remember seeing the younger people in their uniforms down on the borders. So at this time, it would be. So a lot of the larger, you know, public works projects would have been, you're just told by the government, you're going to work on this. Or, most famously in China, you're going to send men from your village to work on the Great Wall. You didn't have a choice in the matter. So the only thing that would get you out of that would be, to be a monk or nun. So obviously the state wanted to limit the number of people. So at this stage, when he's becoming a monk, he's a novice and not doesn't have official support money, not assigned to a temple, and so that leads Kukai to famously wander parts of Japan, especially the island of Shikoku, which now is the Shikoku pilgrimage route. So that might give you some additional insight into the strength of this determination. It wasn't, oh, I'm stressed out. Instead of getting a job, I'm going to go to the temple and let someone else feed me. He didn't have that support. So this is a very unusual approach to the priesthood. This is a significant departure from the norm of how people did things. So it should, I think, really kind of give us an idea of what Kukai was thinking and how intense he took this spiritual search. We do have Kukai's own words. So this is in Hakeda's book, Kukai Major Works. So Kukai writes about this in his text, The Indication of the Three Teachings. And he says, from the time I entered the Buddhist path, I always took a deep interest in the three vehicles, the five vehicles, and the 12 teachings, and studied them to the full. So he's indicating he was very learned. He dedicated himself to learning. Nevertheless, there always remains a doubt in my mind, heart, and I cannot decide. Please, dear Buddha, show me the highest truth. So he had this deep interest in spiritual understanding, but he had a limit. He recognized the limit to what he was learning through books. So part of what Kukai did was undertake extreme ascetic practice. So not only had he left the university and left the comforts at home, he had not entered, a monastery where he could be, guaranteed food or shelter. Instead, he practiced in the mountains in Shikoku. And he writes about his experience. So he has his enlightening experience during this time practicing, and he describes it. So this is translated in Hakeda's Major Works, I think, page 20. The valley reverberated to the sound of my voice as I recited the mantra of Akasagarbha, and the planet Venus appeared in the sky. From that time on, I despised fame and wealth and longed for a life in the midst of nature. Whenever I saw articles of luxury, light furs, well-fed horses, swift vehicles, I felt sad, knowing that being as transient as light, they too would fade away. Whenever I saw a cripple or a beggar, I lamented and wondered what had caused him to spend his days in such miserable state. Seeing these piteous conditions encouraged me to renounce the world. Can anyone now break my determination? No, just as there is no one who can stop the wind. This is interesting because he draws these two comparisons, right? He looks at people with wealth and he's turned off. He looks at people who are suffering, who are very poor, and he's wondering, how people get into this circumstance. So both sides illustrate what we say in Buddhism is the middle way, right? It's a way between extremes. Sometimes it's understood as kind of an extreme position, right? So being a monk from the Western perspective seems extreme, but being a monk from the perspective of someone who's homeless or a beggar probably seems very cushy, right? So this is somewhere in between, not hoarding wealth and this kind of thing, and not being on the other end of the spectrum either. But he's really talking about his practice solidified his resolve. Through practice, he felt, no one can push me off of this path. and he becomes very determined. So the Khoisan website goes on. It says when he turned 22, Daishi changed his name to Kukai. So after his experience in meditation, he changed his name to Kukai. Was listening to a noted high priest at the time, but at any rate could not find satisfaction. So at Todaiji Daibutsuden, he prayed, revealed to this Kukai a supreme precept. In doing so, on the 21st day of his fulfillment, he received the divine message in a dream, saying, in Kumadera Temple, East Pagoda, there's a teaching that you request. And then found the Dainichi Sutra, the Great Sun Sutra, which is a bad translation. It's the Mahabharatana Sutra. Wherever he could by no means understand the Dainichi Sutra, but there was not a single person in Japan to whom he could inquire and be taught. So through all of his teaching, he has this firm determination. He has a doubt. He has a this lingering part of his thinking about the teaching is not fulfilled, and so he's still searching, even though he's had this awakening experience. So why do you think that is? Why do you think he would have a lingering experience even after this sort of awakening experience? Do you have any suggestions? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. It's the one mind with two aspects. So in one aspect, Kukai has undertaken this deep practice. The other aspect is some sort of framework. So I would be willing to bet to some degree Kukai's had this experience, but he's not sure what it is. He's woken up, but he's having a hard time explaining it. How was it that the method he used led to his experience, right? If you're going to explain it to other people, you need to have a deeper insight into the method. And so when he prays for the this question to be answered, he's shown this text, the Dainichi Sutra, and he reads it, but he's still not sure of the meaning. There's parts of it that are not clear. And so he's clear then that he went around Japan trying to find someone who could explain it to him, but he couldn't find anyone. So what do you do when you're at such a position, right? You've given up your wealth, your home, your education, you've undertaken deep ascetic practice. All these things have come up. What's your next step? Why can't you learn from the text? So within the tradition, it requires some oral transmission. There's some part of the text. There's some limitation to the words. There has to be something that's shown. It required experience. It required direct engagement with the teaching. It wasn't something that was you could learn from a book, so to speak. I've heard people who I'm not an artist, but I've heard people who are artists say they have mixed feelings about art school, because they say, well, you can learn methods and medium and theory, but you can't learn to be an artist. You either are an artist or not. And school may help channel that or focus it, but it's not going to turn someone who's not an artist into an artist. I think maybe that's a good example here of there's a limitation to what the text can do. So if you only have the text, you're not going to have what's necessary to have the understanding. And I think if we look, this is maybe what I would say, reading between the lines in Kukai's life story, if we look at what he did first, he studied, then he undertook austerities and had some awakening and realized his awakening then transcended what he had studied before. So he needed to study more so he could put that into a fuller context. So he doesn't read more, he doesn't lecture more, he doesn't find new books. Instead, he boards the ship and goes to China, and recognizing that at this point, Buddhism was relatively newly imported from China a few hundred years. And these texts were still entering the country. So, from his perspective, the way forward was to go to China to the source and seek out more teaching, more knowledge, more experience. Um, Again, Kukai is determined beyond all levels of determination. So, getting to China is not easy. It's still not easy. Actually, right now I don't think we can travel there. Um, but it wasn't easy. I first went to China in the early '90s. It wasn't easy then. I think it was five plane flights, um, and back then the runway wasn't long enough for the 747 to land, so they had to turn too fast so you could sort of hear this. It was like a hockey stop to get on the runway. So that's actually how you got in the country. So, but that was much easier than Kukai's experience. So his experience was to board a ship that had no guarantee of actually completing the journey. Um, the Sea of Japan and that area is very um, known for storms. In fact, the last time I was in China, I was planning to visit an island called Putoshan, and it's a famous Buddhist island. And I had a feeling I shouldn't go, and luckily I didn't. The ferry sunk, so these ships are still going down fairly recently. So there, oftentimes the waters can be very rough off the coast, Shanghai, that area. So Kukai makes a journey, but famously there were four ships that set out. One turned back, one made it more directly, and his one went down, and his ship was blown off course, and he ended up very far south. So he still doesn't give up, right? I don't know what it was like if, when you went to high school or college, but it wasn't this hard for me to get to school. It wasn't this hard to um, find information. You know, at worst, I can remember, still using the card catalog and trying to find books. That was about as difficult as it got. So this is, incredibly difficult and arduous journey. And I point this out because it really highlights the determination. And I think the determination is the other part of the awakening of faith. And a tremendous amount of faith had to have been awoken in Kukai to undertake um, this journey. It had to have been a tremendous energy to give up everything constantly, right? It wasn't just one time and then he's rewarded. It was a constant sacrifice. It was a constant um, moving forward, constant determination to actually get what he was searching for. So periodically, uh, I look at the map of where he landed. So the modern day area would be Fuzhou in kind of south central China on the coast. And I look at the map. And if you aren't often looking at the map of China, China doesn't have a lot of arable land, so most of the country is mountains or desert. So there's not a lot of farm fields. So it's not like walking across Iowa or Nebraska that's relatively flat. So getting anywhere was pretty difficult. There's not a lot of plains areas, and this was about 1,600 kilometers to get to Xi'an, to get to the capital at that time. So overland journey like that, it's difficult today in a Jeep, right? It's hard. It's much more difficult in by foot or mule, as would have been the case during Kukai's time. He still didn't give up. So I point this out because it takes a lot of energy, and that energy has to come from faith. And I think it has to be at that level informed by practice. So this is not kind of the day one. I think if you look at the progression, both from the perspective of the awakening of faith and, as an example for us, his spiritual practice increased as his practice deepened. So he doesn't set off on this journey, at age 7. He tests himself and has this, strong resolve as a young child, but goes to school, and it's a step by step. And with every step, he's throwing himself into this journey and practice incredibly deeply. So he visits China, and I'll pick up again with the Koyasan website description. So it says the Daishi, who heard that there was a noted priest in China at the age of 31, in this year 804, with an envoy of monks studying abroad, departed to Tong, China. So it also mentions that Saicho, the founder of Tendai, crossed at the same time. In a small boat, not like the once a day, they encountered several storms and escaped death to arrive in Fuzhou on August 10th. So he departed in July 6th and got there August 10th. So they were at sea for over a month. So the Daishi wanted to write a letter. The Tong government official was suspicious of the trope and did not let them land. So he wrote a letter to the province director instead of an ordinary ambassador. The director was surprised at the splendor of the letter and allowed them to embark, stating, "This is no ordinary man." After that, together with a messenger from the emperor, he ascended to the capital, Chang'an. So what that story is discussing is, upon arrival, the ship was fairly ruined, and they were mistaken for bandits or not such good people. If you've been adrift at sea for a long time, you're probably not. Your suit looks rather rumpled, is my guess. So what he had, though, was his education and learning. So his calligraphy and the way he wrote the letter so impressed the government officials. They knew this was a very special person. So that'll give you an indication, just from a letter can change people's minds to that degree. So I like how this paragraph says he ascended to the capital as if he just walked up the stairs. So now this was about 1,600 kilometer journey overland. So he arrives in Xi'an and goes to study with Master Huibo. And I think here's another example of the power of experience, right? What I talked about in the beginning, which was something mystical or mysterious. And Kukai has this idea like, oh, this is the temple I need to go to. But upon arrival, Master Huibo recognizes him as someone who's very special. So this happens without, without words, without, it wasn't a special letter of introduction. He doesn't come and lay out his credentials. He just can recognize, here's a student, not only someone who's come all the way from Japan, but there's something special about this person. And so there's this recognition that happens on both sides. And I think that recognition, we could say, comes out of both of their practice, right? Both of them have practiced, both of them have had some level of insight. And upon seeing the other person, can recognize that this person has done a tremendous amount of spiritual work. And so you can see this. So it says the high priest, Master Huibo, met the Daishi saying, "I knew you were coming from before, and I've been waiting for you with great delight." He directly advised him to enter the main temple, and throughout the rest of the summer, he practiced and was immediately initiated in Dishingon. So immediately Master Huigo sees him and says, we don't have much time. We have to get started. So I think Master Huigo recognized that his own life was coming to an end. He was very old at the time, and needed to start this training with him. So we have the dates for Kukai's arrival, which is August 10th in 804. And he presents himself to Master Huibo in, see, I have the date here. either late May or early June. So it's clear that he practices through June of 805, so the following year. So sometime between mid-August 804 and spring of 805 takes into account just the journey to get from the coast all the way to the capital, and then his preparation before he went to meet uh, Master Huego. So this is a pretty arduous journey, right? You get there only to be continuously there's one roadblock after another. So it says Kukai received the Kanjo 3 times in June, July, and August, and was granted the Buddhist name Heinjo Hongo, and became the 8th rank or 8th patriarch in Shingon Mikyo. After which Master Huego said, "You have learned the teaching of Shingon Mikyo completely. Now quickly return to Japan and spread the teaching." On December 15th the same year, being watched over by many pupils, Master Huego passed away. After Master Huego's death, Kukai was asked to write the inscription on his memorial tablet, and his calligraphy and what he wrote was so impressive. It reached the emperor, right? So people had become very much had become aware of this young monk from Japan, and his attainment and knowledge were known far and wide, right, throughout the temple and in that area at the time. So um, I don't have a good example, right? What in modern times, what person goes from obscurity to such fame and honor so quickly. So that, I think, tells us kind of what type of person Kukai was. So sometimes these stories get lost in folktale, or looking back, we build these stories up and make more of them than maybe they were at the time. I think what's unique is that letter that Kukai wrote upon their arrival. The Chinese are very good at keeping records, and they kept records, and those records still exist on the Chinese side, that the local governor was very impressed with this young monk. And these other stories about the historical things are also recorded in the Chinese historical documents. So this isn't just revisionist pious people in Japan making up the stories. These are well known in the historical record also. So this is always something I find very interesting, and I'm also very thankful that the Chinese are such good record keepers. So we have this record to refer back to. Philosophically, with regard to the 10 stages of mind, 10 Stages of Mind is a text that Kukai wrote, and I think there is some things that you can see in his life reflected in the text. So one way you could sum this text up is that there's truth in all teachings. The question is, what degree of truth is revealed in that teaching? So in the 10 Stages of Mind, Kukai lays out his understanding of Confucianism, Taoism, other schools of Buddhism, other schools or other religious philosophy, and explains that ultimate truth, the full knowledge or the full awakening the mind is capable of, is present in all of them to a degree, but it's a matter of understanding how to read the text to look for those kind of hidden messages, and then also understanding to what degree that information is present. And it would say that some teachings or practices reveal more of our ultimate nature than do other teachings or practices. And that the ultimate truth is this non-duality. So this, again, focuses us back on the awakening of faith, the idea that there's one mind with two aspects. So at the same time that there is dualism, simultaneously there is non-dualism. And this is the ultimate teaching in Buddhism, but also if you look other religions, but it's expressed differently. So maybe from the perspective of Christianity, you could say, you know, God is a non-dual perspective, and our separation from the divine creates the duality. So we're trying to merge back with that divine origin. From the Buddhist perspective, it's laid out. The first three chapters of the Awakening of Faith is all about understanding that how we sit here right now seeing things is through the lens of samsara. At the same time, we have this awakened mind, but we don't look through those eyes all the time. Once in a while, right, that awakened self permeates, comes through, is visible in our day-to-day life, but it's revealed through practice. And that's a lot of what Kukai was writing about in the 10 stages of mind. It's a lot about what I think if we look at his life, we're seeing. You're seeing him study and recognize, he's in search of something, and he gets a thorough understanding of it and then realizes the limitations, and he goes on to the next level. So he's constantly searching, and it plays out for him in terms of spiritual practice, scholarly study, as well as the very arduous physical journey across the world to obtain this knowledge and understanding. And I think if you look at the Shingon tradition of pilgrimage, part of that teaching is us getting out in the field, getting into nature is part of that teaching. And so that's why the text I read to you earlier, Kukai uses a lot of examples of his connection with the natural world. So when he's discussing his practice in Shikoku, he says, the valley reverberated to the sound of my voice as I recited the mantra, and the planet Venus appeared in the sky. So at the same time he's doing his practice, he's very much aware of the wider world around him. And where is his dojo? It's almost always in nature. Throughout his life and writings, he is writing about being on Koyasan in the natural world. And that's why at the beginning I use these examples of when we talk about things in the natural world, we recognize the effect they have on us, and we don't parse and try to deconstruct why the natural world is awe-inspiring for us. Right? We see a sunset or a sunrise, and we have a certain feeling. We don't question that. So all of these things that we see, right, with a beautiful vista and mountains in the distance, we have a certain feeling. All of those feelings are very much the mystic, right? They're the mystical aspect. And I think part of what Kukai is trying to communicate to us through his writing is it's that feeling that we're searching for when we're searching for our own true self, when we're searching for our Buddha nature, that it should fill us with that same awe. And so he's taking himself to places that are bigger, right? Bigger than himself. Going to a cliff at the edge of an island and looking out to the ocean. Going to China, much bigger country, constantly expanding his ideas and understanding, so that his mind isn't limited. So he's filling himself or surrounding himself with things that are larger in order to bring forward this understanding, not limiting his experience. And so if you compare, if we do this kind of interreligious dialogue for a moment, you'll find a big difference between the mystic, right? The mystic is looking inside themselves for that realization and then communicates it to others. Um, the prophet, again, is getting something from outside and then saying, this is the boundary uh, of your behavior and your practice. And so they have very different perspectives. They have very different ways that they're presented, and the very different ways that they're practiced, and where you'll find them practiced are also very different. So when we're looking at the one mind with two aspects, right, we spend a lot of time with a very detailed and sometimes dry text looking at the awakening of faith. We have to ask, where does our insight come from? Is it coming from outside ourselves? Or is it coming from inside ourselves? Or is it coming from somewhere else? And Shingon answers this question with what's known as the three powers. So there's a big question traditionally in Buddhism. Is it self-power or is it other power, right? Do you get to enlightenment through your own energy? Is it just you sitting on the cushion and, praying and it's just you? Or do you pray to the Buddha and is it the Buddha that saves you? Is the power come from outside, right? Which is it, other power or self-power? And the Shingon perspective is something different than the answer of one of those two questions. It says there's three powers. There's our power, our energy, our effort. There's the Buddha's power, energy, and effort and vows. And then there's also the Dharma, right? There's the Dharma's power, energy, and effort. So you see that in Kukai's life, right? He's diligent and determined. That's his power. He's studying constantly, right? He tells us in the Sango Shiki, the indication of three teachings, he was constantly and diligently studying all the different types of Buddhist texts he could get his hands on. And then he tells us at certain times in his life and experience, he was directed to a particular temple or a text, or as a child when he was wondering, does his life have meaning? He was, had this saving experience after jumping off the cliff. So he has all three. So these are the three powers, right? We're relying on all three. It's not just our energy input. It's not just us waiting for something from outside. And it's not just study. It's all of those things together. So these are important kind of touchstones or hallmarks within the Shingon tradition. Why am I talking about that? I'm talking about it because when we approach a school like Shingon, it can be misunderstood. And it's often misunderstood when people just see the ritual. They see the outward manifestation and they say, oh, it looks like magic. And then you have to ask, what distinguishes it from magic? And it's the framework, right? It's the underlying framework that distinguishes it from magic. It's not, the magic path is obtaining power. What you're trying to obtain in Shingon is wisdom and compassion. You're not trying to obtain power over someone else. You're not trying to obtain power to use against someone or to get what you want. You're trying to obtain insight. The outward manifestation could be mistaken, right? Oh, that looks like some kind of magic. But in fact, it's based on, and if really looking at Kukai's life, it's based on all three. And what the Awakening of Faith has been saying is when you bring those three things together and you understand that the mind has these two aspects, then our current mind, that's in samsara, and when the enlightened mind can sort of push through and make itself known, then we have this mysterious experience. We have this experience that's very much grounded in the experiential rather than the philosophical. We have something that transcends language. We have something that goes beyond books and papers and studies, that gets out of the classroom and walks through the forest, right? We have this perspective. So Kukai had this experience also, and he had it with regard to a time that was very similar to us. So throughout Japanese history, there have been pandemics and large earthquakes or things that affected a lot of people in in the country. Different priests or temples would often be asked to pray on behalf of people during those pandemics. And if we look at the end of the secret key to the Heart Sutra, the Hanya Shingyo Hiken, there's this concluding verse that Kukai writes. And there's some debate whether or not this is totally historical, but I think it helps to understand this idea or concept with theory and practice and where the two come together. So at the very end of the secret key to the Heart Sutra, it says, relying on the meanings of its secret mantra, I have briefly commented on the text of the Heart Sutra in 5 sections. Each letter and sentence pervades the Dharma Dhatu. Beginningless and endless, they are one's own heart. Ordinary beings with occluded eyes are blind and cannot see this. Manjushri and Prajna can liberate them from their confusion. They pour out the nectar of this merit, giving relief to those lost in delusion. May all together eliminate ignorance and defeat the army of Mara. So this is Kukai's concluding paragraph in the secret key to the Heart Sutra. So he's laid out all maybe the esoteric way to read the Heart Sutra, the various hidden meanings that are in the text. And he says if you rely on the method, he can explain the text, right? So he's got the textual study. And he says, ordinary beings have occluded eyes and are blind and cannot see this, right? So that's the mind in samsara, right? The mind permeated by samsara. But the true nature, Manjushri, right? These bodhisattvas can liberate them from their confusion. So we have your own practice, the study, and then the bodhisattva's spiritual aid. But these 3 things come together. It says they pour out the nectar, giving relief to those lost in delusion. And so then may altogether eliminate ignorance and defeat the army of Mara. The reason this part is very interesting is there's a, I guess, colophon that's appended to the text. And it discusses a pandemic that was happening in Japan at the time. So I'll read to you what's at the end of the text. It says, in the spring of the 9th year, so in the year 818, the nation was struck by a great plague. At that time, the Emperor Saga himself dipped his brush in golden ink and taking up a dark blue paper, personally copied out the Heart Sutra. I, Kukai, wrote down the teachings concerning the gist of the sutra as a text for a lecture. Before I had reached the closing dedication of my lecture, a miracle or vision came to pass. The dead seemed to return to life and stand in the road. The night was transformed by the brilliant light of the sun. This was not due to my virtues in keeping the precepts. It was due to His Majesty's actions in copying out the sutra. Those who visit shrines to pray should recite the secret key. Long ago, in a former life, I sat among the assembly in India and personally heard this profound text expounded by the Buddha. So I have not fully understood its meaning. The memorial presented by Shramana Kukai, who journeyed to Tong. It was common at the time for emperors to visit temples and offer prayers on behalf of the nation. So he's here talking about Emperor Saga personally having written out the Heart Sutra on behalf of those people who were afflicted by the plague. So there's a couple, if you go to Japan now, in most temples, you can have the opportunity to do meditation practice, or you can also do sutra copying. And the most common text to copy is the Heart Sutra. And that's then usually offered at the temple. And usually people have in mind, they're doing it on behalf of, a loved one, someone who's deceased, or they're doing it for illness or these kind of things. So here we have the emperor doing it on behalf of the nation. So imagine a president or prime minister today, going to a temple or church or synagogue or shrine and praying for the entire nation. So this isn't something we see too much anymore. Um, but here we have the emperor doing this on behalf of a pandemic. And Kukai is clear that at the same time he was writing the Anya Shingo Hiken, which at the time was a lecture, later became a text, and he had this national crisis in mind also. So he's very much merging his scholarly practice, his spiritual practice, and recognizing that because both himself and the emperor, right, he actually took time out to give benefit and wanting to benefit others, there was a miraculous response. So he describes it, and I'll read that part again. Before I had reached the closing dedication of my lecture, a miracle or vision came to pass. The dead seemed to return to life and stand in the road. The night was transformed by the brilliant light of the sun. So he has this insight. I think there's a few ways to read this. Historically, there were several plagues that ended or things that afflicted the nation, and Kukai was asked to pray for them. I think he's either seeing people, after they were deceased, those victims of the plague, that they were spiritually elevated or liberated. Because he says, as if in a vision or a dream, he sees this. So he has this insight. But I think that insight is also really helpful at a time of a pandemic when you're losing so many people. You can very easily lose hope. And at the very least, I think we see Kukai saying, the nation was not losing hope because of his actions and the actions of the emperor. The people were not losing hope because of this spiritual insight. I'm going to share another picture. We are in Obon season, so I hope that comes up on the screen. So this is an image. Oops. This is an image of Molian saving his mother. So this is the famous story of the beginning of Obon or Ulambana season, where one of the Buddha's disciples was praying, and he was foremost in spiritual powers. And one day decided he wondered what had become of his mother, and directed his mind to his mother's spirit. And through his psychic ability, saw that his mother was suffering. So this is one of the traditional pictures of that, right? Seeing the mother, bound and in a state of suffering. And he goes to the Buddha and asks, what can he do? And the Buddha gives him instructions on how to do spiritual practice on behalf of others, especially those who are deceased. And he does that practice. Oh, sorry, the train's passing. He does this practice, and the texts in Buddhist history tell us that Mulian's mother was liberated or saved from her suffering through the spiritual practice of her son. So this practice becomes what we now call Obon, and when we're doing memorial services on behalf of individuals. So the practice is very much connected with actual benefit to others, and Shingon to say that comes from the three powers, that if we're studying and practicing, we're putting our energy in, then there is some response from the Buddhas. The awakening of faith would explain that as our spiritual practice is helping our original nature, our Buddha nature, to emerge, to permeate through samsara more effectively. And I think this is important to point out for Shingon as a esoteric or a mystical tradition, is sometimes we can either get lost in theory or we get lost in feeling, and we don't have a structure in which to understand what we are feeling or experiencing. And by studying the theory, right, giving our time to look at the awakening of faith in theory, you're supposed to understand the world of enlightenment, right? What is this world that we're talking about? How is it structured? What are its rules? What are its bounds? What does that look like? And then practice gives you real world experience to enact or bring forth that enlightened world that you learned about. So you study the text, you say, okay, this is what the enlightened mind is supposed to be like. Then you sit down and do your practice. You're trying to bring that enlightened mind out. When you have your breakthrough on one side or the other is going to be different for everyone. So you may have a deep philosophical understanding, but find, oh, my practice isn't doing so well. Or you may say, like, oh, my meditation is really good, but I don't really understand the teaching yet. So one of the reasons you need both is so that if you don't have the theory, your practice isn't guided. So you can go off the wrong path and end up down, a dirt road with, you see that sign, last gas was 60 miles ago. It's too late. So you don't have there's nothing to guide the practice. You don't have a framework for understanding what you're experiencing. And I think worst case, you have a practice with power, but no ethical guidelines for its use. So this tends to be the danger in the West. There's a lot of scientific research on meditation and the benefits of meditation, but they take away the ethical framework. And more recently, they're finding there's very little benefit to that style of practice. So the philosophical understanding, the framework, is just as important as the practice. But if you're doing the practice without understanding, you're not getting the benefit. So without the theory, the practitioner may not even recognize when they've had insight. Right? If you don't know what you're practicing for, looking for, you're not going to know when you have your aha moment. I think there's a bit of that in Kukai's own experience. He has his awakening experience and still goes on looking for more teaching because he wants to know, what exactly have I experienced? How did this method operate? Why is it that this worked and the others didn't? How do I put this into a better framework? So when he comes back from China, he spends a lot of time writing. So this is where we see this kind of explosion of very brilliant insight into the merging of practice and theory, and Kukai having this very deep understanding that within exoteric teachings, there is the esoteric. Within the natural world and the sounds of the natural world, there is the teaching of the Buddha, right? He has that ability to see. It's possible, we could say, earlier in his life, he didn't have the same words to describe what he had experienced or his insight. Maybe his insight was very raw, right? It wasn't within the framework. So for us, it's a little bit more dry to go through the awakening of faith, but it provides this framework for our practice, for understanding. One of the things I said I wanted to point out at the beginning, I'm often asked, why Shingon isn't more popular. Partially, it's because it is an oral tradition. So there's things that you can't learn through a book, and that limits some people's understanding, but it also, the journey is not as hard as Kukai's journey, but it might require some searching. And life is hard, and we have responsibilities, and it might limit us in that search. So I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see Shingon temples as prevalent as Zen temples or Vipassana meditation centers and things of that nature. The theory part is also important. If you look at Shingon ritual, and if you even look at behind me at statuary and decorations, without a framework, it may be difficult to understand why things are necessary. And I think this actually does explain one of the reasons Zen or some of the other forms of practice are more interesting to Americans. And this isn't universally true because Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of the same accoutrements of practice that we do. But a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism come from a more highly educated background. So the majority of American Buddhists are college educated, and they usually encounter Buddhism in college or at that stage. So they come with a skeptical mind, a thinking mind, and when they see what looks like ritual or magic or tradition, even just tradition, there's a part of the academic mind that pushes back and says, well, let's boil it down to its core. What's most important out of this? And so this, I think, is often why people gravitate towards Zen. They're like, okay, this is the practice. I'm going to sit and I'm going to get my insight. But even more important for the Shingon perspective, to understand the purpose of the practice of rituals, the framework is important. The framework is important in all schools, but especially in a school that relies on mystical experience. And by mystical experience, I mean direct, actual experience, insight, walking the pilgrimage route, smelling the incense, the ambiance of the temple, saying that part is important. Having the framework is incredibly important so that the practitioner doesn't get lost in the decorations, they're not lost in the emotional side of practice. You want to have a framework in which to tie onto and understand your insight, but maybe more importantly, understand where you still need to work. And I think we see that in Kukai's life. He was incredibly accomplished, both in terms of arts and letters and writing, as well as his practice, but he was still compelled to seek out more instruction, understanding that his insight needed more in which to teach it to others. So his true goal was to help others. If he was really dissatisfied with the limitations of Confucianism, then he needed to be able to articulate fully why that was, how that operated, so that he could teach others. It was not enough to say, look at me, I got it. Well, other people are going to have questions. So you need to be able to articulate that fully in a framework so that other people could see the method, understand the theory behind it, and then that would draw them in and they'd have the same ability for awakening. The basis for this, right? What is the title of the text? The Awakening of Faith. So the basis of all of this is faith. Kukai is not going to get as far as he got without faith. We are not going to get through the text without faith. We are not going to come back to the practice without faith. And in this respect, I think faith is a type of energy that we need to propel us along the path. Why didn't I throw the book across the room and just give up and go, it's so dry, right? It was faith. Why, does someone continue to sit in meditation? It's to some degree a level of faith. And that's the other part that we need. We continue to practice. We learn the theory. We fumble through our practice. but it's faith that keeps us going. And in Buddhist faith is not blind faith. It's not something we're doing without understanding. We're studying to give framework even for our faith, right? Why does our faith operate? Why should we have faith? How do we get it? And we're getting that faith through right, the three powers: is our power, the Buddha's power, and the power of the Dharma. We're bringing all those things together and trying to understand the method, and we're building our faith. It's not something that you get, fully powered up on the first day. Right? So when I started studying Buddhism, I didn't have cell phones didn't exist, but my faith cell phone battery was not fully charged. I had 2%, and then over time I built it, and that propels you. So the insights and experiences that you get, we may term them mysterious. So to that degree, it's mystical. They are mystical. Those experiences are mystical to the degree that our true nature is not fully revealed. Right? This is straight from the Awakening of Faith. Our true nature is not fully revealed. So to our mind right now in samsara, whenever we get a glimpse of our true nature, whenever we have some experience and practice, it appears mystical. It appears like magic. And that's why we need to have faith that's firmly rooted in a framework. And that framework, again, the Awakening of Faith is an outline, but it's a way to sort of tie up to a framework so that our practice continues and we have some guideposts as we go along. And I think you'll see a similar kind of guideposts in Kukai's life story. So if you're interested in reviewing that, Kukai Major Works by Professor Hakeda, the first 100 pages or so really lays out the life story of Kukai. It's very good. It's a very good translation in English. So I always get something out of it reviewing it every few years. So I think if you look at the life story, you'll see in many cases all of our spiritual journeys. Kukai, of course, went beyond all of us, and that's why that's why we're here right now. But also, it helps to build our faith to see someone who went beyond what seemed humanly possible and actually achieved it, and came back to tell his tale and wrote about it and did so eloquently. And if you look at this ending part of the Secret Key to the Heart Sutra, even talking about how do you benefit people directly in time of pandemic, something that we find ourselves in today, right? So our spiritual practice is not separate from the world around us. Oh, I went over by 3 minutes. I apologize. So are there any questions? Earlier, I talked about how Buddhism does not have a monopoly on the truth, and that other traditions touch on aspects of the truth. How would you explain the benefit of Buddhist practice over other types of spiritual practice, or no practice, to someone who is inclined to see this sameness in all spiritual paths and neglect the difference between them? That's a really good question. I would say, so the 10 stages of mind lay out, from a Buddhist perspective, this unfolding of truth at different levels. And from a Buddhist perspective, they are understanding, not understanding, experiencing that yourself is not separate from the universe. What Kukai points out in the 10 stages of mind is things like Confucianism teach ethical behavior. And you can get far in ethical behavior, but he points out that the limitations, so a lot of religious instruction ends at ethical behavior. A lot of the limitations of ethical behavior is it's hard for us as humans to push our ethical behavior beyond our immediate environment. So we can practice ethics towards our parents, our grandparents, our friends, our classmates, maybe even our community. And he says that the height of Confucian practices, extending our ethical behavior and our regard to wise people, right? That we see someone who is wise or a good teacher, and we take care of them or we show benefit to them. But it's harder through that teaching only to extend that regard to a community 400 miles away. It's harder to see ourselves in the suffering of those people. So, how do you expand the human capacity even beyond that? How do you get away from your own salvation or wanting the best for just the people you care about into the bodhisattva vow of seeing all sentient beings as equal? How, to use a good example here in Portland, how do you stand on the street and have the same regard for your fellow protester as the person beating you or tear gassing you, right? Can you see that? Can you recognize, oh, as much as I'm mired in the mud of suffering, so is the person in, the helmet and riot gear beating me. They are also mired. We are both sharing this moment of suffering. Um, the, the law enforcement officer who's recorded hurting someone is suffering in the same way that I'm suffering. The family of the victim is suffering in the same way as the family of the perpetrator is suffering. That's difficult work, but if we truly see ourselves as not separate from the universe, from all sentient beings, and that's the type of mind we're cultivating. And that's what Kukai's hinting at. He's meditating, and he sees the planet Venus. His awareness is, on a universe scale, not a myself and my small community scale. It's I'm willing to leave my country, in the early 800s to travel to bring back a teaching for my entire country to help spread this teaching. Those are bigger than how do I get saved, or if I can save or if I can get other people to convert to my religion, then I'm saved, right? It's not a me focus. It's how do I do this so that I can help others? How do I do this so that I can benefit others? It's not even, at some point you recognize it's not about yourself. And I think that's, from a Buddhist perspective, unique. It's true of all religions ultimately. If you read the theologians of other religions, that's true, but that message gets lost. And I think even a lot of practitioners wouldn't say that. I think Buddhism, I'm biased, obviously, but I think Buddhism has done a better job at keeping that message of universal compassion at the forefront of practice. But we still have work to do. But it is there in some regard in all of the religious traditions. We didn't make it up. We don't have a monopoly on it. We don't, claim to be the one true way or something of that nature. It's more the perspective of the practice and the goals of the practice. And really, if you do read the sutras, it's, constantly reminding people that it's not only about them. That's a very brief answer, but I hope that was helpful. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I was really struck by what you were saying about what motivated Kukai. And that I think that we can see it ourselves. I mean, I don't know everybody who's on this call, but most of us have absolutely no reason to be here. I mean, it wasn't as if anybody, I mean, there was no impetus in my life to become a Buddhist.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely
okay.
none. And there really isn't any impetus to continue to be one, really. So just the fact that we're here kind of shows us that there may be something to the two minds. So
I think so. My father tells me all the time that nothing he exposed me to growing up explains what I'm doing now. So there may be something. I tend to believe that. So for me, when I encountered the teaching and the awakening of faith, I was like, oh yeah, okay, this makes sense. And even in this kind of colophon to the Secret Key to the Heart Sutra, it's disputed whether or not Kukai wrote it, but I think it's helpful just from a Buddhist perspective. He said, those who visit shrines should recite the secret key. Long ago, in a former life, I sat in the assembly with the Buddha and personally heard this profound text. So have I not fully understood its meaning. So he's even saying, I remember sitting, in the assembly with the Buddha, but it's taken me, several hundred years, 1,000+ years later, to get to this point. So, what draws all of us here is a bit mysterious. For me, that's true. Anyone else have any questions? Or I hope that sometimes when I sit down to write these, I just have this kind of thought that enters my mind, and I think, I'm going to try to weave together these ideas. And I'm not always sure if I wove them together successfully, but I hope this evening was helpful and not as line by line. I think we'll take more timeouts like this and talk a little bit more about the context and history of these texts and why they might be a little bit more valuable. And I think given everything that's going on in the world, if we don't spend more time on the practical application of things that are happening around us, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. So, well, I've kept you for a while. I thank you for correcting me earlier about the Canadian lack of compulsory service. I was talking to that knowledge goes back to a conversation when I was about 15 or 16, and one of the young recruits was telling me, but maybe his parents made it compulsory. But thank you everybody for being here tonight. We had 17 people. We're starting these big numbers. I appreciate everybody's mysterious reason for being here, and I hope to see you Sunday for the movie discussion. And if not then again next week, definitely. So if you have any ideas or things you heard tonight that you'd like to hear more about, please let me know. I'll happy to expand on them. I know I jumped around to a couple different texts. So if you want to know where I got it, everything that I'm reading from is available in English and freely available for the most part. So I'm happy to share it too. So, other than that, thank you. Have a good evening. Everybody, please be safe and take care of yourselves. Good night.